tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So in this perfection of wisdom literature that we've been looking at, grounded in the idea and the recognition, the view that all things are empty of stable, eternal self-identity or swabhava, innate being or substance. Grounded in this, the text unfolds into an extended investigation of aspects of the Dharma that have to also be recognized as empty. And so we saw at the beginning this whole investigation of the emptiness of language, right? The language about the path has to be seen as empty. Even ideas about the path, ideas about liberation, ideas about suffering, and ideas about the one who traverses the path, the practitioner, the bodhisattva, the one who gives rise to a thought of liberation. All of those are empty concepts, empty words. From there, I think the authors of these texts recognize, the mystical experience that underlies this text recognizes that once we start doing this, we begin to encounter layers of concept. And often it's easy to conceptualize the emptiness of some of the more surface or cognitive storylines that we run. But that there are deeper ones that take some excavating, right? It's relatively easy enough to think about something like, my relative identity in the world as being empty. I'm a Californian in the 21st century. I have the social positionality that I have. I have my particular identity markers, and some of those identity many things like identity markers. If I was going to use a word like queer or a word like mixed race, 100 years ago, no one would know what I meant by those things, and in this very moment, in all sorts of places on the planet, no one would know what I meant by those things, even if they spoke English. Heck, some people, across town from me here don't know what those things mean, because those are very, very specific. They're almost like hyper-specific markers of membership in a knowledge community that we might call a community or culture or something like that, right? So many of our cultural arguments are about language, right? How do we come to agree that words mean what we say they mean? What do the words woman and man really mean? And do we as a culture agree on what those mean? What do words like life mean? As in, when does life start? As in, when does, like these are arguments about language that they're arguments because language is empty, right? If we all knew that a word always referred to a specific thing, and we all knew what that thing was, and there was no ambiguity about that, in a way we could say the word wasn't empty. Say, oh, this always means that. That's kind of a pre-modern non-philosophical approach to language, and it falls apart upon investigation. And so the text starts with language because language is actually one of the easier things to deconstruct. And if you thought that language was hard to deconstruct, we're going to get to harder things to deconstruct, right? So you start off with language, say, okay, the ideas that I can have about something are contextual, I know we were talking politics a little bit lately. We talked the word brat in the little break here. And, like a meme is memes are so empty because their power, their force, their meaning is only what it is, in some cases for a few days before it changes. And it already means something different. We were just talking about how, there's a whole meme going around about how Kamala Harris, the vice president, who's now the presumptive Democratic nominee after a very dramatic weekend, is brat. And how that designation and the color that goes with it, lime green for whatever reason, rides upon an album by a certain pop star right now, which rides upon, a legacy of other statements within the kind of feminist punk, stream that has somehow led to this moment where, Charlie XCX and Kamala Harris are crossing over in the memosphere in some odd, completely not predictable by me way. Those things point to something about culture that is, like radically interwoven, and part of tracking culture is actually learning your memes, right? Like knowing what all the quotations are, right? All of those many, many, many spin-offs of the British advice billboard to keep calm and carry on depend on awareness of some history of that meme, right? The ones that say, like, shut up and drink your coffee are only funny because the original British one. And the original British one is only funny if you have a relationship to a certain, personality of the British. And, that sort of thing. And of course, all of that rides on the very real history of when that thing was invented, which was in the middle of World War II in the bombing, and Londoners hiding in the subway tube. So culture and language and image, you can see, are deeply conditional, contextual arisings that arise in a moment based in the coming together of conditions. They dissolve almost as quickly as they arise because conditions change so fast. Right? So culture is empty, positionality is empty, and to the extent that we have identities that are based on cultural material, those identities will be empty in the same way, right? I told the story a while ago of teaching this lovely retreat for the Gay Buddhist Fellowship, longtime Buddhist group in San Francisco, and having a conversation with them about whether about how to phrase the affinity invitation for the retreat. It's a group of older men who traditionally have used the term gay men for themselves. I'm a bunch of years younger than the median age in that group, and I might be inclined to use words like queer male identified, which is a completely different thing than gay man. In the cultural, sphere, they point to different identities, and they might point to the same person, like the same person might say, oh yeah, that word defines me well enough. This phrase defines me well enough. But there's been enough change in the culture for there to actually be real impact to the shift of using those different phrases. So the phrases are empty, and the identity of being, let's say, a queer person or a queer man or a queer male identified person or a gay man, those identities are empty because they depend on the context in which those words, those labels arise. Just because they're empty doesn't mean that they're not real or meaningful or carry cultural weight, and in specific places can get you, a job or a boyfriend or killed, and so it's always important with emptiness teachings to remember that everything is empty, but still has impact. And so mostly I'll end up saying that things are empty but real, right? Or insubstantial but real, and they have impact. And so as we go down the layers of the psyche, and the text takes us through some layers of the psyche, language is empty, the idea of the practitioner is empty, that means that the language around the path is empty. And where does it go from here? So the text goes into a particular thought exercise or comparative exercise that hinges on the idea of merit. And so what the Perfection of Wisdom texts do is they say, suppose a practitioner, a devout, person on the path, did something that that's a traditional religious practice or ritual practice that gives rise to a lot of merit, and the text will say things like, suppose they built stupas to honor the relics of the Tathagata, the relics of the Buddhas, and suppose that they built these stupas, as many as there are sands, on all the beaches of the world, sands on the Ganges, and they filled the universe with stupas. In other words, they, did an enormous amount, a sort of cosmically enormous amount of religious worship. How great would their merit be? Super great is the answer. Unimaginably great. And then the text will say things like, greater than that is the merit of someone who, memorizes one stanza of this teaching and repeats it to others and preserves it, or writes it down, copies it, and venerates it. Right? We talked about veneration of the text a couple weeks ago. It'll say, so there's all these comparisons. The person who, does just this little bit of a gesture toward this teaching of radical emptiness generates a body of merit tremendously more vast than the one who does all this religious practice. And as the text goes on, it refines even that and says that the one who does some cosmically enormous meritorious act, giving things, venerating things, doing meditative practice, all the things that generate merit, versus someone who in their mind, like in their meditation, scoops up all the good action that anyone has ever done and gives it away in their mind, as a rejoicing toward the thought of full enlightenment. In other words, there's the person who does all this practice, and then there's the person who, in their meditation, collects all of the goodness that's ever been done and gives it away. The one who does that imaginative giving away has the greater merit. So I'm going to talk about merit a little bit and back up, as I've been doing, to the early teachings, and then work our way forward to what this kind of gesture could mean for us. That the idea of giving away everything becomes this supremely meritorious act. So merit is a concept that shows up early in the Buddha's teachings. It's in the Pāli canon. The Pāli word is puñña, and as usual, the concept in the early discourses is relatively straightforward. The Buddha will say, there are streams of merit that ripen in goodness, that ripen in heaven. And there's several different lists of these. One of the most common and useful for us is one that says that there's 8 streams of merit. These are, universally thought of as good. These are things to cultivate, and they ripen. In other words, they're good. They create good karma, good momentum in your life, and they ripen as beneficial experiences and as a better or more wholesome rebirth next time around. And so these 8 things are the observance of the 5 precepts. So ethical practice is fundamentally meritorious. So not taking life, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, not lying and misusing speech, and not misusing intoxicants. So the 5 lay precepts create merit when we keep them. And then the 3 refuges of going for refuge to Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, to the teacher, the teachings, and the spiritual community. And there's other lists of these that include, things like the recollections, and the refuges parallel the recollections. So recalling the good qualities of the Buddha, the good qualities of the Dhamma, the good qualities of the Sangha. And there's some other lists for monastics that include virtuous monastic activity as well. But let's just think about the precepts and the refuges here as a basic list. So these are streams of merit that ripen in goodness. The idea seems to be that merit is a way of talking about how the actions of practice accumulate or generate a kind of momentum of goodness. So what does it mean to, not what does it mean, but like what happens, let's say, when a practitioner keeps the 5 precepts for a while, right? So a few things happen. So let's say you make a vow to keep the precepts. You take the precepts at retreat or in the Sangha somewhere, or just for yourself. You say, I want to give attention to these, intention to these. I'm going to keep the precepts. And so you make an intention to do so, which is considered a wholesome intention, right? All the precepts are a kind of renunciation. So there's the intention to not do things that cause harm. So that's wholesome. But then what you actually do then is you live your life. And as you're living your life, again and again, you come up to the edge of breaking a precept. In other words, life happens around you, as it always does, through you. And you find yourself in situations where it would be really convenient to lie a little bit. Or it would be really convenient to overstep, or push on a boundary with someone's body. Yeah, I want to kiss this person, and I'm not quite sure if they want it, but I kind of want to. I come up on the edge of the precept. I want to take something. I'm not sure it's been offered. Something's been left out on a picnic table. I've been looking for one of these things for a long time. What should be done? Or you start to wrestle with your diet and you think like, oh, what about all of these beings that get killed so that I can eat them? Or you start to wrestle with your habits around some other kind of consumption that you understand leads to harm for beings in some way, right? You start to wrestle with your use of substances and you say, does the use of this substance actually give rise to wholesome states of mind for me? Is this a medicinal substance or is it not really actually? And you start to play with that. So you come upon, in ordinary life, the situations that bring to mind your vow to keep the precepts. And then you remember that vow, you remember your intention, and you want wholesome states of mind. And then you do something in that moment that we call keeping the precept, right? You refrain from killing the insect, taking the thing, kissing the person inappropriately, saying the lie, using too much of the intoxicant or using the intoxicant at all. You do something to hold yourself back from something that might cause harm, even if you're not sure it will. But part of how the precepts operate is that they become a kind of, they become a kind of guide, a kind of border. They're the rumble strip on the side of the road. You start to veer a little bit and you haven't crashed yet. You get a little, and you're like, oh, wake up here, watch out, and you pull back. So that's precept action, right? What is actually happening as a practice as you're doing that? Sometimes we think about purification like, okay, there's a result in my own mind stream of more, let's say, tranquility. As I do that for a while, This is one of the classic results, right, of keeping the precepts. You do that for a while, and you have less things that you're doubtful about or regret about, you know? You wake up the next morning after the party, and you're like, oh, I remember what it was like to wake up after the party and be like, oh my God, what did I do? You know? And I don't even remember what I did because whatever. Now you wake up after the party and you're like, oh, I didn't do anything that I regret. Woohoo! You know? Not bad. Not bad. What is that, right? That's a mind state. That's a wholesome state that is the result of doing this renunciate practice. So that is one result of the precepts. And then, maybe you sit down in meditation and your mind is not spinning as much. You're not full of like, oh, why did I say that in that conversation? Or why did I do that thing? And the mind gets a chance to be more tranquil. It's a classic result of the practice of the precepts. Merit is something else. So that's a start. That's what happens when we keep it. But what would we say then over time? What is happening? We might say that the mind stream is becoming purified, like our habits are changing. We become less drawn to things that don't lead to well-being. We learn, oh yeah, I did that a lot, didn't lead to well-being. I did this, it led to well-being. So that our habits start to change. Merit is a way of saying that doing this over time creates not just change for myself, but it creates a kind of energy or force of goodness. That it's just good to do this, and that goodness is a substance in a certain way, right? And in an ancient understanding, this force was something that could be used even in a material way. That if you think about how a saint could heal people, what do? It's not that they themselves have some sort of like power. They're not a Marvel superhero. But they have something, right? Like healing is real. And we had, there's too many stories of it being real for it not to be real, even if it's rare and difficult to understand. But a healer or a saint of some kind, puts their hands on someone, and what do? I think what they do is they get themselves very clear internally, and the goodness of that they've accumulated over time has a kind of power, and that power can be transferred. It can actually have an effect. There's all these, and there's studies that have been done in modern times about the efficacy of prayer. And one that I really love, they did these double-blind studies where they took these people in, they identified a bunch of people in like a cancer ward in Oregon. And they did not tell those people which one of them was being prayed for. They just put them on a list without names. They made them anonymous, just numbers, but they tracked who was who. And they didn't tell who was being prayed for and who was not. It was all completely unknown to them. And then they went to a bunch of church ladies in like Tennessee, Baptist church Christians. And they said, there's a bunch of people and we want you to pray for them. And we're not going to tell you their name or anything about them, but we want you to pray for them. And they figure out a way to give these people a sort of anonymous, like you're praying for this list of people, right? No names, no identifying marks, no cultural material, just a bunch of numbers. And the church, there was a bunch of grandmas, a bunch of devout Christian prayer folks who are used to this. They're professionals at this. They do this all the time. You pray for a list of people, all the people who are sick in your parish. They read the list, you pray for them. So the grandmas pray for some number of people and not for the other ones. And then they track their statistics over a little bit of time. And I throw my hands up at this result, but the ones that were prayed for did better. Like statistically, they tracked them for a while, and they improved more. They died less, you know? And what you do with that, I don't know, right? But this is a known result, and so something happens in the kind of spirit realms, however you want to say it, where goodness of a certain kind is not only accumulates as we do practice, but is transferable. This is the mystery of merit. So the early Buddhist conception of merit is that there's a stream of merit that ripens in goodness. You keep the precepts, you recall the good qualities of the triple gem, and you get better. You get freer. Your practice progresses. You get reborn in a good place. That's a stream of merit that ripens in goodness. As the tradition developed, this idea started to arise, and it's philosophically difficult. And the old philosophers wrestled with this, because the Buddha himself would say, I cannot liberate you. I can't liberate someone else. People would say, Blessed One, you're super powerful. You can control the elements. You can levitate. You can, you go to heaven realms all the time. You're fully enlightened. Can you liberate someone else? And he would always say, no, I can't do that. That's not how it works. I can teach, but I can't walk the path for someone else. And he would give the example of, he would say, let's suppose, you're at a crossroads and you meet a farmer there who lives there, and you say, which one of these is the road to Varanasi? And the farmer would say, that one. Walk that way, take a left at the fork, go 100 miles down the river, and there's Varanasi. And let's say those were good instructions. If you follow those instructions, you get to Varanasi. The Buddha would say, but what about a person who heard those instructions and then went the other way? Didn't follow the instructions. Would they get to Varanasi? No, Blessed One, they would not. The Buddha would say, just so. I know the way. I give good instructions. But if you don't follow the instructions, man, you're not getting to Varanasi, And so that makes sense. But there still arose this mystery, I think, and I think it is a mystery in the way that prayer is a mystery. That there's this thing, so the merit generated by good, wholesome action of practice, that it can be given away, and there start to be stories about what happens when you give away merit. And one of the important ones is that you can dedicate the merit of your own practice to beings that are suffering, and it will help them. And one of the main classes of beings that you can dedicate merit to are ghosts. And ghosts are particularly thought of. These are the hungry ghosts, pretas in Sanskrit, or petas in Pāli. The hungry ghost realm is full primarily of your own ancestors who have not practiced, or who've done unwholesome things, or who have had tremendously bad karma for whatever reason. And they're stuck in this awful situation, tremendously hungry, unable to get fed, filled with longing that can't be sated, they feel like they're dying of thirst, but their mouths are like pinholes and they can't take in any nourishment. It's a psychologically evocative image of deprivation and want and the inability to be nourished. And the ghost realm is very close to this one, so you can see them sometimes. There's stories of people who could interact with the ghosts. And so people would say, how can we help them? Because, of course, the way that you get a better rebirth is by doing wholesome things. But there's a paradox. Beings that are in really difficult bodies, that have been reborn in a difficult place, there are ecosystems like the ghost ecosystem where it's difficult to do something wholesome, right? And maybe we could think about this in a very straightforward way, like for people who are, immersed in the depths of suffering like that, the folks that are, like in the depths of famine or profound violence where there's no nourishment, life is completely precarious. It's it's still possible for for many people to do something wholesome, something selfless, something generous in those situations. We see stories like that all the time. But there's other folks who are unable to do that, where the suffering is so horrible, so traumatic, that it's very difficult to even do something generous or come up with even the thought of being generous, or the thought of renunciation, the thought of giving, the thought of nonviolence. It's just too hard. So ghosts, the hungry ghosts, they're too immersed in the horror of their state to give rise to a wholesome thought themselves that could give them a better rebirth. They're too traumatized, essentially. And so what can you do? Because these are your relatives, right? What do you do for your own ancestors? You love them. They've fallen onto hard times. What can you do? What you can do then, it arose, because the doctrine is you can't save them. So what do? You do something wholesome yourself, like you do a meditation, and then you take hold of that blessing or merit that you created by doing that wholesome thing, and you dedicate that to them. So there's this action of dedicating. You can give away the blessing that has arisen as a result of your practice. So we do this at the end of practice all the time, right? That's what the sharing of blessings chant does. May the merit of this practice be given for the well-being of my mother and father and all beings. And so with the ghosts, you dedicate some merit to them, and they notice. And they can't. The thing that they notice is that you did it, and they appreciate that. And appreciation is mudita. That's a brahmavihara. So for a moment, if you can get them to notice, and you do it by dedicating it with some force, you aim it to them, they notice, they have a moment of appreciation, and that moment of appreciation is enough to kick them out of the ghost realm. And they immediately disappear from the ghost realm, and they get reborn in another realm. Either they get reborn as a human, or in a better divine realm where they have more agency. Right? And so you can do this with animals that are stuck in miserable rebirths. My teacher Christopher Titmus in India, we were on retreat. Millions of mosquitoes flying around in the hall. Everyone's sort of huddled under their shawls. And at one point, you're just meditating, and you can hear this whine of the cloud of mosquitoes over you. And Christopher said, 10,000 lifetimes as a mosquito, if you get reborn as something like a mosquito, very short life, but you might have that same kind of life over and over and over. It's hard to generate a thought of generosity and renunciation as a mosquito, and so you end up in a kind of loop. That's partly what's considered unfortunate about the animal realm, is not that all animals are suffering or can even have generosity in their hearts, but that in many corners of the animal realm, the cycle is not conducive to giving rise to thoughts of renunciation and loving kindness. So, okay, so you can generate merit through practice, and then you can give it away to ghosts or people who need it. And the transfer of that merit, then the gift, has a kind of power to it. So I've even heard some scholars propose that the developing of this, the transferability of merit, the philosophical development of this, and making it much more central in the religion was what was necessary for Buddhism to propagate in China. Because Chinese culture was deeply invested in ancestor reverence. And for Buddhism to show up, and particularly Mahayana Buddhism, this particular Buddhism we're looking at here, the emptiness of all things, shows up in China, and it has nothing to say about ancestors because everything is radically empty, and rebirth kind of blows away the concept of ancestors somewhat. And so it doesn't take on. It doesn't take root. Nobody picks it up. It doesn't conform well enough with their indigenous worldview that ancestors and ghosts are real and they're present and they need to be honored and respected. And so then this concept that you can transfer merit to your dead relatives suddenly becomes like, oh, that totally makes sense to the Chinese psyche, because they understand that there's a relationship between the living and the dead that can be maintained through ritual offering. And suddenly Buddhism takes off like wildfire because it's coherent to the indigenous worldview that was there. So from this basis, merit as a transferable blessing force, in the Prajnaparamita, then we start to see these comparisons. If someone did a huge amount of meritorious activity, how would that compare to someone who approaches this teaching of radical emptiness? And you can see how what it's doing is it's saying, okay, now you need to not be attached to this deep concept of merit. But to deconstruct merit in a certain way is like deconstructing the path itself. Because I imagine you can feel then how this idea that when we practice we generate merit, this could become a deeply motivating aspect of the religion, and it actually becomes, in a way, the engine for practice to progress. Because you're doing something. You know how it feels like you've been practicing for years and nothing's changing? I don't know if you know that feeling. I know that feeling. You're like, yes, you don't have to raise your hand. Yes, I know that feeling. Right? The idea of merit, I think, in part, speaks to that I think very natural doubt. What am I really doing, this sitting in stillness here? I'm not feeling any less stressed, and I'm not really helping out the world. So am I just like spinning my wheels, right? But the teaching on merit says you're absolutely not. Because just to do the ritual of bhavana, of practice, generates something that is intangible but perceivable or conceivable. And it has an efficacy whether or not your practice is actually succeeding in, bringing about tranquility or insight, something like that, right? It makes there be an intangible result of practice that's wholesome, that is there, no matter what your practice feels like. And I think this is very helpful, because practice doesn't always feel like it's going somewhere. And I've totally been on retreat where I've had retreat days. Some of you have been on long retreat, many of you have, and so I have no doubt that you've had days on retreat where you're like, oh, I just tried my damnedest the whole day. I sat and I walked and I ate and I was in silence and I interrupted my wandering thoughts with mindfulness and I brought it back and I just kept trying to be present with myself, and I was just like distracted and grumpy and sleepy and anxious and everything, lusty and confused and greedy and I had immoral thoughts and I had wandering thoughts and I didn't love the Dharma and I didn't care and I just kept sitting there waiting for the bell to ring. And now it's 9:30 at night and I'm tired and I don't feel like I've gotten anywhere today and I'm not tranquil at all. And now we're doing the sharing of merit. And we say, may the goodness that arises from my practice, through the goodness that arises in my practice, may my spiritual teachers, my guides of great virtue, my mother, my father, I give away the good that arose as a result of my practice. And one of the things that's amazing about that chant is that it just knows that you've accumulated goodness by practicing. It doesn't say, if I accumulated any goodness by practicing today, may it be for my benefit and the benefit of others. It says, may the goodness that arises from my practice, no doubt. And I've had moments on retreat where the day has just felt like a wash. But I get to that and I'm like, okay, I don't know what arose as a result of this day of practice, but I put it on the altar. Like I give it away. And I think there's such a wisdom and a beauty in that gesture, that acknowledges how not just hard, but also long and weird and not linear and frustrating the path can be. And you just say, I take it all, I scoop it all up, and I give it away, for the well-being of others. And this then, I think, this is part of the power of the merit teaching. And when the perfection of wisdom takes this up and they say, okay, now take that, which is powerful in and of itself, and then wash it through this strange membrane called emptiness, or see it through the lens of emptiness, filter it through the understanding of emptiness. And what you get is something immensely more powerful. What we get, I think, is the reminder that that there's the real effect of practice and there's the realness of blessing, but that it's going to be a trap to get caught in even that, to get caught in the idea that I'm a being who's generating goodness. Oh, I'm a bodhisattva who builds stupas. I'm a meditator who does 2 months of retreat at a time, who gets ordained, who makes generous donations to the monastics. I do all the right things, and the text comes along and says, the person who studies one line of this text generates more merit than that, right? And it's not saying that, like, don't do that. It's saying keep it in perspective. Remember that this too is just an arising as a result of conditions, and it's as intangible as anything else. And when it does that, there's a beautiful interpretation of this. This is a little spin in Red Pine's book on the Diamond Sutra. He's discussing this, and the Diamond Sutra is the abbreviated version of this Perfection of Wisdom, 8,000 lines that we're looking at. And Red Pine says, if we take the translation directly, it says, the person who does all this meritorious activity, the body of merit, the amount of merit that they generate is how much? It's immense. And then the person who memorizes one stanza of this teaching and repeats it, the body of merit they generate is, incalculably more immense. And what Red Pine does, this is Bill Porter, an extraordinary translator and scholar and teacher. And those of you up in the Pacific Northwest, you can go and hang out with him. He's in Port Townsend, so and still alive for a short while yet, perhaps. May it be long, but he's an old graybeard at this point. So if you want to go see him, go find Red Pine at the Port Townsend meditation community. And he says, remember that the body of merit is the body. So the bodhisattva actually generates a kind of body, a kind of spiritual or energetic body. And so what this means in a way is that with the view of emptiness, there's a kind of blessing that arises that changes one's own body. We might say changes the way one embodies the path when this body of merit is generated. One of the things about merit, of course, is that the action of giving it away generates even more. So, you're pouring buckets of merit out of your, ship that that's not the right metaphor. You do a thing, something accumulates. The more you give it away, the more appears, right? So you can't give it away fast enough. And what this becomes then is the bodhisattva whose entire practice now becomes inhabiting or embodying the intention to give, right? And this connects the perfection of wisdom, which is in the Mahayana system, it's the sixth of the paramis, the great perfections. It connects it with the first one, which is dana parami, the perfection of giving, right? So here we have the person who gives material things, and then the person who gives the thought of enlightenment without holding on to it because they recognize that it's empty. That becomes an unparalleled gift. And so the body arises of the one who has dissolved into the giving, or who has fully become the giving, not just the giver in a kind of subject-object, I give to you, but more like the bodhisattva recognizes that the whole universe is only this flowering of gift, of this flowering of blessing, you know. So pulling this back then, as we have to do again and again with the emptiness teachings, here we are, practitioners, in a complicated culture, in a complicated moment in history. These teachings suggest that we spend some time in our practice, coming into contact with the view or the deeper layers of how we understand ourselves on the path. What does it mean to be a practitioner? What are you going for? What are you trying to make happen? And what is the energy or the force generated as you walk the path? And that we're to ask ourselves this, to investigate this, and then not accept as final an answer that is too limited. I think something in this reminds us that as spirits or souls or cosmic beings, somehow we are so much vaster, or we have the potential of accessing in our practice something so much vaster than the small goals that I have, you know, as a practitioner. I want to deal with stress. I want to, you know, deepen in samadhi so I can find liberating insight. I want to be free of suffering. Like, even if I have a very lofty goal, I want to be fully enlightened in this lifetime as an arahant, or I want to dedicate myself to the bodhisattva path to liberate all beings through all cosmically extended time and space. Like, I could have a very vast religious view, or a very, you know, psychological, imminent, particular goal in practice, or both of those. Many of us have multiple layers of goal. This teaching says, interrogate every layer of that for places where we've fixated ourselves, where we've made the path too narrow, where we've come upon an idea and we've taken on that idea. You know, I've become a convert to Buddhism. What does that mean? You know, I've taken on the idea of the Buddha. What does that mean? You know, and it says, you cut through all of these things. And as you do this inner interrogating, what you're looking for, you know, to bring it all the way back to the beginning of the teachings, what you're looking for is grasping. There's going to be a layer of grasping to a concept of ourselves and the path and what we're actually doing, even to the idea of liberation. That if we can contact it, what we're going to find is a kind of fixation, a kind of artificial solidification or reification of a concept and a self. And that must be seen through if a deeper freedom is to be found. And so I think in a very practical way, this tells us to watch out for the solidification of views, the solidification of identities. You know, how do we, with all good intention, how do we become too solid or too, you know, fixed in our idea of who we are and what we're doing on the path? And so some amount of merit is generated by your lovely self doing the lovely activities of the path. But how much more could be generated if you actually saw through even those constructions as being cultural, limited, temporary, you know, conditioned, based in identification with, you know, certain communities, certain psychologies, certain narratives that are both helpful in practice, like they help motivate us in practice. You have to have a goal in practice, but at the same time will eventually become stale and have to be refreshed, reinvented. right? You have to renew your vows again and again until they become you so fully that they're no longer a vow, really. They become, the bodhisattva vow becomes reality itself in an unbounded kind of way. So, encouragement to never settle until, I'm not going to finish that sentence. Encouragement to never settle, period. I'm not going to say until, because to say until would be to fall into the same trap, right? Of planting a flag at a pretend endpoint. There is an endpoint, but if you think about it being an endpoint, you've missed it. So put that in your teacup and drink it mindfully. All right, thank you for your warm attention and just for the willingness in this group to go toward teachings like this. Remember that core teaching, that the one who is unafraid when hearing these teachings has the conditions of the bodhisattva. So it's a pleasure, and it's pleasurable for me to even try to find my own way through them as well. So what a joy.